So I've been asked to speak on a topic of whether it's true that business principles are the same across different cultures globally, or whether it is that in different cultures business principles actually are different. I've had the privilege and opportunity to live across 10 different countries already for at least 3-4 years. I've been living in China now for the last 10-12 years. I'm an Indian citizen myself, and except for possibly the African continent, I've lived pretty much in every continent so far. So I have been very fortunate to have insights and exposures into many different cultures. And over the years, what I've understood and what I've learned is that, frankly speaking, when it comes to business, if we want to focus purely on the business side rather than interpersonal relationships and so on, if we talk about pure hardcore business, the tools that we use in business are pretty much universal. So you could get an MBA in any country in the world and take those same tools and go to any other country in the world and run a business. But those are tools in terms of managing your business, evaluating performance, financial metrics, how do you run an HR team, how do you do marketing, so on and so forth. The general tool set, I would say, is relatively transferable across cultures. However, if you truly sit back and think about what business is all about, it's effectively relationship-based, it's about transactions, but it is run and managed by people. And those people are influenced by the cultures in which they operate, or the cultures in which they grew up in, or where they come from, right? Their ethnicities, their nationalities, the languages that they speak, the kind of schools that they went to when they were growing up, the universities that they went to, and what influences they've had over time. So when it comes to actually looking at businesses in different cultures, the tools might be the same tool set, but then how you interpret the results of those tools, or how you might actually use those tools, would probably differ across cultures. I mean, to give you a simple explanation, if you look at, or a simple example here, if you look at the issues of hot button topics both in Ukraine or in India or in China where I live, are corruption. Now, corruption is a reality of life in our countries. Now, in other countries, predominantly in some of the Western economies, it's not as well tolerated or expected and so on. So therefore, the way you would run your business and how you would make decisions, how you would approach different stakeholders, partners, or governments and other officials and so on would be very different because of a cultural reality. But if I were to figure out what is the financial impact on my business of corruption, I would use the exact same tools at my disposal, whether I'm an American company in America or I'm a Ukrainian company operating in China. There will be the same sort of return on investment decisions in terms of paying for corruption and how that impacts my bottom line, and whether that value that I'm going to get, at least from a financial perspective, is justifiable and acceptable. The moral question, the ethical question of this, I'm not considering at this point, because ultimately in our geographies, it's something that you either accept and are willing to do, or you completely reject and don't do. But then, of course, that impacts your opportunities and so on. I don't think the example that I chose was more to discuss the ethical element, but was more to illustrate how cultural differences might impact how you do the business. Another, aspect of this would be how you engage with your employees, with your team, and how you manage them. Different cultures have certainly very different ways in terms of interpersonal relationships. And those facts become very important in terms of the kind of processes, the kind of corporate culture that you have within your company to sort of manage, motivate, inspire your team to deliver the returns that you're expecting. For instance, if you are in India, in many cases, even today, it's fairly all right to not be punctual. Now, that doesn't work in Japan. That certainly doesn't work in China either, right? So some of those kind of cultural nuances or cultural differences impact how you conduct yourself. But when I'm in that meeting, how I discuss my business with an Indian counterparty versus a Chinese or American I mean, the fundamental business principles of what I'm trying to achieve are effectively the same. How I engage with that person and how I sort of structure my relationship or negotiate with that person to achieve my goal, my business goal, that is greatly influenced by the culture. If I'm working with a Japanese counterparty, I know already that it's going to take a while for us to build a relationship. And in that entire time, my Japanese counterparty and I should be meeting fairly regularly, exchanging notes, getting to know each other, befriending each other, and over time, at some point, we will agree to engage in some business, some cooperation, some collaboration. Once that happens, it's generally accepted that the Japanese counterparties become long-term partners. But you have to invest in that. Most probably, maybe not in all cases, I'm sure my Indian friends, some of them would disagree, but my impression is that if we are talking the same scenario with Indian counterparties, you would now be meeting them, talking to them, and then the value proposition that your discussions and negotiations bring would decide relatively quickly whether they're going to work with you or not. Clearly, building relationships is important, but it doesn't have such a long cycle to sort of break into a new relationship and, start collaborating, start doing business together. We understand, if I take China as an example, it's very well known that China leverages a lot of relationship issues in business. In China, business is done because of relationships, right? You build those relationships over time and then you leverage them. Increasingly, though, China and doing business in China becomes less relationship oriented and far more hardcore business facts and business exchanges oriented, right? And I think that is probably the largest and most significant difference. You have to separate sort of the tools that you're using in business, which are fairly consistent. How you interpret balance sheets, how you interpret P&L accounts or cash flow statements and the ratios that you use and all that, that's fairly consistent across borders. That doesn't change. However, how are those tools to then be used in specific cultural context is different. And that part, that cultural context which comes from the people element of business, which is frankly in many ways probably the single most important element, that is where things become slightly tricky. And that's where you have to understand the cultural reality of the market that you're operating in, the cultural reality of the team that you're working with, or the partners and clients that you're engaging with, and tweaking your tool set to then optimize and get the result that you want. In a short time, this is probably sort of the best answer that I can provide.